Good day. Welcome to this lecture called Weaving Mathematics. Creating Mathematics, the creation of a pattern in the woven artwork of one of our indigenous communities in the Philippines, which I will share today in this lecture. Let us take a look at this woven cloth by a Tibolis weaver. We cannot help but admire this work of art, the beautiful indigenous pattern and the exquisite blend of colors. The cloth is carefully woven and crafted. It is culturally priceless as it is built from a dream and valued for its myth. This dream pattern recalls the branches of the kekem, the healing tree. According to a Tibolis myth, the kekem served as the way for good people to go to heaven. Mathematically, we marvel at this cloth for the richness of its geometric and algebraic structure. We imagine how a motif is repeated in the cloth. So how do we look at this culturally prized object from a mathematical lens? I will talk on the use of geometric principles to study a repeated pattern as what we see in this cultural artifact. A basic tool for the study and creation of pattern is symmetry. Symmetry has been used in previous studies in crystallography in art and cultural heritage to classify, analyze, and compare cultural material. In my own research the past years, I have used the symmetry framework in collaboration with artists, crystallographers, mathematicians, educators, and anthropologists to compare different kinds of cultural ornaments from various indigenous communities, such as textile, fabric, basketry, mats, and even tattoos. So what is symmetry? Let us take a look at this star. This star is symmetric. It looks the same from different positions. Some of its parts are repeated. What is the reason for these underlying observations? Rotating the star 90 degrees clockwise sends the star to itself. The 90-degree rotation is what we call a symmetry of the star. A reflection about the vertical axis sends the star to itself. So I would also say that the reflection is also a symmetry of the star. So this star is symmetric because there are certain motions or transformations in the plane that will send the star to itself, leave the star unchanged, or keep the star invariant. So a symmetry of an object in the plane is an isometry. It is a distance-preserving transformation that sends an object to itself. So how many symmetries does this star have? Earlier, I mentioned there is a 90-degree rotation about the center of the star. There is also the 180-degree rotation, the 270-degree rotation, as well as the 0-degree rotation. Then there are also reflection symmetries. So we see on the screen 4 axes of symmetries, reflection symmetries. So we have the vertical axis, the horizontal, as well as 2 other diagonal axes. And reflecting the star about any of these axes will send the star to itself. So if we take the 4 rotations and the 4 reflections all together, these form what we call the symmetry group of the pattern. And in higher mathematics, this symmetry group of the star is called the dihedral group of 8 elements. So now let us consider this tiling consisting of hexagons, otherwise known as the honeycomb tiling. So let us imagine that it extends indefinitely on the plane. It fills up the screen of, say, your computer or your laptop. So this tiling is also symmetric. There are also certain isometries that will send the tiling to itself. So a repeated pattern or a tiling such as this, the honeycomb tiling, that repeats periodically or regularly in two directions in the plane will contain what we call translation symmetries. So let us take a look at what is happening to this tiling. So notice that there is a shift of a certain distance in a certain direction dictated by the direction of a vector. So this is an example of a translation symmetry, and the vector is called the translation vector. So let us again take a look at this other vector, and notice again another shift of a certain distance in another direction. So this is another example of what we call a translational symmetry of this particular honeycomb tiling. So we have seen now two different translation symmetries. So a repeated pattern, such as this honeycomb tiling, has two translation symmetries in two directions. Now, observe that this pattern also has rotation symmetries. So there are actually rotational symmetries with centers at the vertices of a hexagon of a tiling. There are also reflection symmetries with axes or the reflection lines coinciding with the sides of a hexagon, such as what you see in the screen. And there's also what we call a glide reflection symmetry. So what is a glide reflection? So it is actually a composition of a translation followed by a reflection. So we shift or we glide at a certain direction and then we reflect. So now we have seen translation symmetries, rotation symmetries, reflection, and glide reflection symmetries. And actually, one can also consider combinations of these, all of these symmetries I mentioned, and these are also symmetries of the tiling. And there are actually infinite symmetries for these particular tiling, actually for repeated patterns. So unlike what I've shown earlier, for the star, there are only 8 symmetries. So in which case, how would one determine the symmetry group of a repeated pattern such as this? So actually, the classification of a repeated pattern symmetry group, or the classification of repeated patterns according to their symmetry groups, is actually a two-dimensional counterpart of a system where crystallographers classify crystals. That is why the symmetry group of a repeated pattern is called a plane crystallographic group. And it is a well-known result that there are only 17 plane crystallographic groups, and we can prove this mathematically. Now, take a look at these 17 repeated patterns on your screen. So each pattern is invariant under one of the 17 plane crystallographic groups. And in addition to translations, a plane crystallographic group will contain any one of the other plane isometries, the rotation, the reflection, glide reflection. And any pattern you see, any repeated pattern, whether it be any tiling, say that you see in a floor, or ornaments, repeated or cultural ornaments in a ceiling, or even a repeated pattern in the tinalak, will have symmetry group exactly one of the 17 plane crystallographic groups. So at this point, I would like to illustrate to you a construction of a repeated pattern using one of the plane crystallographic groups, symmetry group, by applying certain symmetries. So I begin with a triangular region. Now let's apply a reflection, then a rotation, and 2 linearly independent translations, and then I obtain a repeated pattern in the plane. Observe that my starting point was a triangular region. So the starting point is actually what one calls a fundamental region of the pattern, whose images under the full symmetry group of the pattern cover the plane. Now, every repeated pattern has naturally associated to it a lattice of points. So you see on the screen all these gold points, which are centers of rotation. So we choose any point in the pattern, and the lattice will be the set of all images of that point when acted on by the group of translations. So a lattice cell or unit cell actually is a parallelogram whose vertices are lattice points. And the vectors which form the sides of a unit cell generate the translation group of the pattern. Now, one of the 17 plane crystallographic groups is actually identifiable by this unit cell. So if I have a repeated pattern with a symmetry group, one of the 17 plane crystallographic groups, this lattice cell serves as sort of a signature as to the symmetry group of this particular pattern. So that the study of a pattern in a cultural ornament, such as the tinalak, would actually entail determining the symmetry groups and identifying these kinds of unit cell. And what we do is we superimpose the unit cell on the woven fabric. So this is actually the summary of the mathematical principles behind the analysis of repeated patterns in a woven fabric. And now I would like to take you to a journey to this peaceful place, this placid Lake Cebu in southern Cotabato, or in Cotabato in southern Mindanao. So Lake Cebu is home to the Tibolis, one of the indigenous communities in the Philippines known for their weaving tradition. So the Tiboli weaver uses wild abaca thread to produce ikat patterns, colored black, red, and natural beige, the original color of the abaca leaves. According to Tiboli belief, these are the colors of the three places souls go to at death. And the ikat cloth is called the tinalak. So the Tibolis weave the tinalak relying on a mental image of the patterns, which are either passed on from one generation to the next, such as from mother to daughter, or bestowed upon to the weaver by Fudalu. Fudalu is believed to be the spirit of the abaca through dreams. Thus, the Tibolis are also called the dream weavers. So the tinalak is actually a product of hard work, as it takes months, several months to weave a fabric, and a lot of ingenuity as the weaver translates the repeated images from memory to loom. And I would like to say that the tinalak is as much a quietness of spirit as of skill, as not all women weave and not all weavers dream. The tinalak is a prized possession used by the Tibolis on special occasions such as births, weddings, or funerals. Now, let me describe the weaving process. First, what the weaver would do would secure the warps on a frame, and portions are knotted at the precise intervals. So I would like to emphasize at precise intervals with a particular counting involved. So the knotting is actually there to resist the dye. And the weaver knows this as he or she envisions the repetition of the pattern. And then these threads are submerged in black dye and dried. Next, the areas that are to be colored red are untied. And again, the weaver calculates this accurately and precisely, ensuring that no threads are accidentally cut, and these threads now are boiled in red liquid. And finally, the rest of the knotted portions are untied, and these become the areas that appear in the natural color of the abaca leaves. Then the threads are now returned back to the loom. The weaver spends a lot of time bundling, ordering the fibers, laying this out in the loom, and then the weft threads are then interwoven perpendicular over and under the patterned warp threads to produce the woven fabric. So let me now consider the pattern I gave earlier, the first pattern, the bed kekem. So in the analysis of the symmetries, we assume again that this pattern will extend indefinitely on the plane, so it's a repeated pattern. And you see now the unit cell superimposed on the fabric. And you see the reflection lines. So the reflection lines there are perpendicular to each other. And you see there the oblong shapes. These are the centers of 180-degree rotation that lie at the intersecting points where the two axes of reflections meet. And this particular symmetry group, we call this, the symmetry group is PMM. Now, the notation is what the crystallographers use. It's called the International Union of Crystallography notation. And P denotes a primitive unit cell. In this case, it's rectangular. And M and M denote the two mirror reflections that are distinct, the axes of which are perpendicular to each other. So let us now consider another intricately woven pattern. This time, this is called the Tofi Kemu. And observe that the design elements are bunched up the way fingers come together in a fist. And the weaver articulates the repetition in this manner. And mathematically, as shown from the unit cell, the vertical lines denote the axis of reflections. And observe there are small dotted light blue lines. So these are the axes of glides. And they are perpendicular. And here, the rotational symmetries, the oblong shapes, are centers of 180-degree rotation on the axis of the glides. And the symmetry group here is the crystallographic group PMG. Again, a primitive unit cell, then there's a mirror, and this time a glide. These are shown here, represented by their axis of symmetries, and that's why we call this PMG. Now, here's a third pattern. This is called the Doun Basag Senko. This is a traditional pattern that features the leaves of a plant with an unusual shape. Here, the lattice unit is a rhombus. So the symmetry group is CM. It's a centered unit cell. And you see here two lines that are parallel. The blue line is the reflection line, and then the glide now is the dotted blue line. So finally, I'll show you the last pattern. This is called the Gondong Tahu. It has one of the more interesting symmetry groups mathematically because, as you see from the unit cell, there are the reflection symmetries and that, with axes that are perpendicular. There are also the glide reflection symmetries with axes that are perpendicular, and the 180-degree rotations. The centers are found both in the axis of reflections as well as the glide reflection axis. So what I have shown you are actually 4 tinalak patterns with various symmetry groups. Each has a different symmetrical structure. And in our research, we have found 5 of the 17 plain crystallographic groups in the patterns of the Tibolis. And in each instance, there was always a vertical reflection symmetry present. So how does the weaver create the woven pattern with mathematical precision? So actually, the presence of vertical reflection symmetry is a consequence of the way the threads are knotted at intervals with precision before the dye is applied. So I would say when they are tying the knots, they also have something like a fundamental region of sorts. They use this as a starting point, and then they repeat, depending on the pattern, what they have in mind. And in addition to that, there is also the careful count of the weft threads over the laid out warp threads that actually reinforces the appearance of the pattern on the cloth, as well as the combination of the pattern with the colors. So it's very interesting to note that aside from the rectangular type of lattices, there is a lot of CMM symmetry group type, the one with the rhombus lattice in ikat. So this is the rhombus lattice, and this is not common in other types of weaves. So it is customary for the ikat patterns in the sampling that we have to have motifs that are arranged diagonally following a rhombic lattice. Again, possible through the manner the threads are knotted before the dye is applied. And in our research, we have seen that this type of weave is not easy to achieve in decorative weaves, which are mostly rectangular lattices. And as we have concluded in our research, the tendency of a particular symmetry to be more or less common than another can indicate relationships between the symmetries and the weaving technique or the culture that produced them. In this lecture, I showed samples of the richness of symmetrical patterns found in the tinalak. So in the first part of my talk, I have shown you a pattern that I created using a dynamic geometry software through the application of symmetries. It is remarkable that the Tiboli, isolated in their own world for a long period of time, has woven these repeated patterns of high symmetry given only the weaving tools that they have, and without knowledge of advanced concepts in geometry. And the whole weaving process actually is a cultural activity and experience that defines the Tibolis. But from a mathematical standpoint, the whole weaving process indicates or shows mathematical precision, from the tying of the knots, the laying out and careful count of the fibers, to the counting of the weft threads over the warp threads. And this is indeed evidence of the raw mathematical talent of the weaver. So this talk, or this lecture, reinforces the view that mathematics is found in cultural practices. It is hoped that this lecture not only showcases the mathematics found in the woven dreams that is the tinalak, but more importantly, highlights the technical skill, the mathematical ingenuity of the Tiboli weaver, and eventually contributes in some way to the preservation of their craft. So thank you very much.